Hello, and welcome to the Social Ride Guide podcast. This episode is part of the Ask the Organizer series where we chat with, you guessed it, organizers of rides that have stood the test of time to last 2 years, 5 years, and beyond. Today's guest is the organizer of History Bike Gainesville, which is quickly approaching a decade of rides. Don't let the brevity of this episode deceive you. There are many gems and takeaways for organizers who want to build rides that outlast them. Without further ado, here's Nigel of History Bike Gainesville, recorded at Depot Park in Gainesville, Florida. Today we're joined by Nigel for one of the early in a series of organizer interviews to discuss how great social rides are organized from people who have done it for, we'll say, at least 1 to 2 years. In your case, much longer.
Yeah, I didn't even realize it had been almost a decade. It's been great, and there was a few years in the middle where there's something happened in the world. I don't remember what it was. It was some kind of pandemic or something, and so it kind of knocked us out of commission for a little while. But we're back up and running now, riding.
Right on. So, if you could, for people who don't know what History Bike Gainesville is,
Okay.
Do you have a 30-second elevator pitch?
Yeah. So History Bike Gainesville is a program of the Florida Public Archaeology Network, of which I am an archaeologist and a public outreach coordinator, public archaeologist. So we sort of work as facilitators between academia and the general public to try to bring the interest of Florida archaeology and history to people that might not be within the world of archaeology and anthropology. And so History Bike was borrowed from History Bike Tampa, which was organized by a high school history teacher. And they get sometimes hundreds of people on their rides. And they do once a month. And it's amazing. So I said this would be a great idea for Gainesville. I asked permission to use the name History Bike, and they gave me the thumbs up. They came to my first ride, and it was great. Yeah, and then we've just been going.
So that actually explains one of the questions I had for you.
Okay.
When you began, what was the initial impetus for History Bike, and then what were your first steps to act on that?
So, great question. What gave me the idea was the unique history of Gainesville. At the time, and I suppose still is, a bit of an obsession for me. And so it's a fascinating history. Those of y'all that aren't familiar, it goes back well into the 1600s. Lots of Spanish people, indigenous people, pioneers, the whole 9 yards. Everybody was here. And so communicating that information, that really unique information about Gainesville to the general public in a unique, fun way. So I've always been a big bike guy, worked in many bike shops, always been into bikes. And so I wanted to sort of pair these two things that I really love, history and bicycling. And then I saw History Bike Tampa, and I was like, okay, there's a format. Now, getting started was tough. The Gainesville bike community is fantastic. Great groups of folks, but it's a little bit hard for outsiders to come in. And so I was coming in, and I got a little bit of pushback from people, not regarding bicycles, but more regarding history. And so folks they thought they knew everything about Gainesville history already, so why would they go do anything like this? And I was like, well, listen, the history is just a hook. I just want to get people to ride bikes together. The history is just like the frosting on the cake. I just want a group of folks getting together to ride bikes and talking. I think that's like one of my favorite things in the world to do. And so getting started was a bit of a struggle, getting interest, but it happened. People showed up. I think my first ride, I had about 50 people. And we got poured on, and it was wild. We got absolutely drenched on the Hawthorne Trail, but everybody came back for the second one too. So
the second one, that brings up the next question. Kind of what was your expected frequency of rides in the early days when you went into it?
So I was initially going for once a month, and that quickly changed to once a quarter, so once every 3 months. And that is because Gainesville is not Ybor City. Gainesville is not Tampa, which has a much more condensed population and a much longer, more vibrant history in a lot of ways, with being a port city and everything. So I couldn't completely mimic what History Bike Tampa was doing by having the tours every month. I needed to find a little bit more research involved than just communicating facts about spaces. I'm an interpreter, so I was interpreting the history in a way that is interesting to people, and trying to find rides that are interesting to people.
So how did you select your kind of day of the week and day of the month?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's varied. It's usually on a Thursday or a Saturday, I found. So most of my rides have started and ended at First Magnitude Brewing Company. So I had to make sure everything was thumbs up from them, being that it is a beer establishment. Having something later in the afternoon so people could come back and have a beer was key. So late afternoon rides, early evening rides has kind of been where I've focused, and primarily on Saturdays. And occasionally I've had to do one on Thursday, but and then I've done some on Sundays with the museum, the Florida Museum of Natural History.
Yeah. Okay, and for listeners who are not aware, First Magnitude is close to a rail trail system.
Yes.
Which we are recording adjacent to it in somewhere called Depot Park currently. So that's the background noise that you hear. So were the start and stop locations initially significant to the ride? First Magnitude's location, and if so, why?
Everything, yeah, absolutely. That was First Magnitude's location is ideal, not only because it's right on the rails to trails, which goes, if those of y'all that aren't familiar with Gainesville, it goes about 15 miles into the city of Hawthorne. So it's a 30-mile round trip, give or take, on the trail itself. We've never gone the entirety on one of the bike tours, but yes, First Magnitude's access to all of downtown was absolutely key.
Great. And so over time, with the exception of one period we're all aware of, did the ride grow over time?
Yes, it did. I get a lot of returns of people that are been on multiple rides. I've had folks that have come on all the rides, which is really fantastic. And we've had some times where we had 5 people, and we've had times where we've had 50 people. So when you're doing this kind of thing in a college town, that has the possibility of really beautiful weather, sometimes it's hard to compete with other outdoor events and other things people want to do. But yeah, it's been a successful program for sure.
And so you've had some riders who are kind of long-term riders,
yeah,
frequent or all of the rides, kind of sense that that's built its own little community.
Mm-hmm.
Are there things that you've done to intentionally grow or kind of protect that community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably could do more, which I think everybody would say if they were being honest. I've kind of plugged the events at other bicycle friendly events to try to get the cycling world, or the Gainesville biking world, to be interested in the event as a historical opportunity. And then I've really plugged it into places to get non-cycling folks out as well, because I think that's what's great about having the historical interpretation, is I can get people that are into cycling, because it's a cycling event, who might not know the history, and then I get people that are interested in the history who might not be familiar with biking involved as well. I mean, we've had kids of all ages, like little kids and older folks out there riding, so it's been a very wide-ranging group.
Right. So you actually brought up a good point. So what are your primary, secondary kind of channels for outreach that the event's coming?
social media, Facebook, Instagram, which is hard. It's really, really hard. Those of y'all that have done it would recognize that. And so I didn't, for the longest time, up until fairly recently, I didn't have, it was just me. I didn't have an assistant at all. And so now I have an assistant that is helping with a lot of that stuff. And I admit that's been one of the places I've failed was not pushing it as well as I could have on social media. And I've toyed with putting flyers in bike shops. I've done that a couple of times on some larger rides, and I can't really tell if that was successful. I never had anybody come forward and say, we saw the flyer at a bike shop. But social media is kind of the only way to go now.
Right on. And so actually you dovetailed into my next question. Do you have co-organizers? You have someone who's assisting you with it. And how much thought have you put in as it's gone almost a decade into, I need to build up other people to help, or one day you'll be old like me and you'll say, I want to find my replacement. Right. Are those kind of the things that have you given much thought to those? Or?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm very conscious to that. And part of it is because I only see through my eyes. So I only see possibilities of bike routes through my eyes and my interests. And so getting sort of somebody else's perspective on what might be interesting to the general public is really important, I think, engaging that. And my assistant helps me with, nobody needs to go down this one road. Nobody needs to see this. Or it would be awesome if we went over here instead. Getting outsiders' input into not only the historical interpretations, but also the bike routes themselves. And that's sometimes a challenge in places, even as bike-friendly as Gainesville is, it's not completely bike-friendly.
Yeah, so along those same lines, you kind of mentioned Florida Museum of Natural History, so you've had some partnerships there. And you've mentioned that there are community members, people who have routinely come. Are there things that you kind of do to highlight, outside of just the partnerships, highlight the people that are helping or that give you input, or are there things that like build?
Yeah, I always point out the people physically at the start of the rides, and if I can, I'll embarrass them some way in the middle of the ride, just so people understand that this isn't a one-person game, and it takes a community to get this going. And I think the rides are better when I have outside help. The rides are better. They're more thought out. The history that I'm trying to convey is more thought out and more heavily researched. And it helps the vibe. Partnerships kind of help the vibe of having a successful ride, And it's really key. Partnerships are really key.
And so when you have those kind of informal co-organizers or single event co-organizers, do you find that the more of those you have, the more people are stepping up to do that, or?
No, not really. And I wish that were the case. I've literally put out on a podcast that I've done and all other avenues, like, give us information. Like I've mentioned, if you have an idea for a tour, if you have an idea for a route, if you have a historical location that you think would be perfect for a History Bike Gainesville ride, let me know, and we can work together on trying to get this done. And I wish I could say that people have really taken that bait and jumped on it, and on assisting, but it really takes me asking them. It's tough still.
That's like a really valuable point. So if someone's trying to create a social ride that has some other dynamic other than just the ride, the start and end point kind of deal, you're actually running sort of two outreach programs, one for the riders and one for soliciting input on what the next ride would be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. There's a lot of complexities in organizing a social ride like this when there's like a distinct educational component, right? And so I have to not only be aware of what's going on with the safety of the group. As the leader of the group, I want to make sure everybody stays safe, but I also have to remember where we're going and what the it will be at my next stop. If it's a game day, or if there's a lot of traffic, or if there's all these different contingencies have to be considered. All these different things have to be considered in order to have a successful ride. And all that could be going on between my ears. It doesn't necessarily need to be conveyed to the group, but it takes a lot of work to even get going. And safety's key, of course.
I remember, I think we had a Facebook exchange or something almost a decade ago. I was like, what are you using to shout out where the stop is, or what's is this a bullhorn scenario, a little speaker? Like how do you convey messages along your route? Do you have someone else kind of helping at different points, or?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had for a while a microphone kind of speaker setup, but I can project really well. And as a trained interpretive guide, I know how to project, and I know how to communicate to the person at the back of the row, and I have the gift of gab, apparently. And so I got rid of the microphone thing because it just ended up, I would forget to turn it on, or it would be on nonstop, and people would hear me coughing or sniffling or worse. So I just project. As far as when stops happen, I always try to stay at the front of the group. I'm always in the lead. Oddly enough, that's only a challenge when I have children on the rides, because they want to be up front. And so it's a little bit more difficult, so I slowly stop and then, give the stopping, international bicycling, we're stopping symbol, and hope everybody sees me. The groups tend not to spread out too wide, and I always try, not always successfully, but I try to have other people that are familiar with the route on the tour. But a lot of times it is just me, so I'm hoping everybody's behind me.
Okay. So that's great to know. And so do you convey all of that with some sort of standard speech or something at the beginning of the event, like pre-ride?
Yeah, pre-ride speech always. I kind of highlight the theme of the event. I highlight the route, where we're going, whether there's going to be bathrooms available, whether there's going to be water access. I make sure at the start, does anybody need to go to the bathroom? Because there's a bathroom at our destination or wherever the farthest place is. And then basic bicycling safety stuff. If it's in the evening or at dusk or even during the day, I recommend people use their tail lights. It's just so we can be more visible. Stay as tight as a group as possible, because we still contend with people staring at cell phones instead of staring at the road. So the bigger the group is, the easier it is to spot. But all that gets covered in the pre-ride speech. And what I often do is forget to talk about the actual history of the ride, and I focus more on trying to keep people safe.
Priorities.
Yeah.
So great. So do you then kind of going into the ride, or do you ride the route before you do the ride, and does that play into your pre-ride speech? Are there things that are you looking for a bathroom stop if it's a long ride, or the?
Oh, absolutely. I always pre-ride. If I can't do it a couple of days before, I try to do it that day. And I'm usually fairly familiar with the locations that we're going to. I ride all the time throughout the year and throughout town, so I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the spots that we're going to. But planning turns, if there's road construction, all that I want to know in advance. So I could bring that up in the pre-ride. Listen, we're going to be riding on the sidewalks for a little while just to get from A to B very quickly, and then we'll go back on back streets, or we're going to be riding on a busier road. Please stay to the shoulder as best as you can. Or if there's a large enough group, I say, in this particular area, let's just take the lane. We're just going to take this lane. We're legally allowed to be in this lane to get us from A to B safely. But yeah, pre-ride, absolutely necessary.
Awesome. And then Is there kind of, when you're doing your pre-ride, is there sort of a checklist of what you ideally want to see and or like bare necessities? This is what makes it a no-go for me, or I need to find an alternate? Or
Good question. I've never encountered a situation that would lead me to like stopping the tour. Is that what you mean? I've never had that happen. One time we did a tour during the summer, and the heat was a major factor. And one of the participants passed out, fainted from the heat at one of our first stops. Luckily, we were in a park by a water fountain, and everybody acted appropriately. But that was the only time I've had to really consider that there might be circumstances out of my control that we should go ahead and call this ride. But we didn't. Even then, she was totally cool with us keeping going, and I always try to find shade. During those summer months. Obviously we have a long stretch of really beautiful weather here in this part of Florida, so that's sort of a blessing. But the sun beating down on you can really suck it out of you, and we're doing physical exercise. So
yeah, for sure. Okay, so I guess with that, there aren't any things that you've come across that would really just kill the ride altogether. Though Florida rain is going to catch you one day.
Yes, it has, and that has happened. I've had to cancel rides because of rain, and that I usually wait till the absolute last minute to do that, because we get people that travel from out of town sometimes for these rides. I mean, it's mostly local because people ride to the brewery and ride back home afterwards. But we do get some people that travel, and I don't want to cancel a ride and then have the rain stop 5 minutes later, which is like how it works in Florida sometimes. But Florida, you can't compete with the rain. It's just not, that's the only reason I would stop a ride. We did have some violence once that we ran into, that I wasn't leading that tour. I wasn't even on it. One of my colleagues was leading it. And it was right outside of the start. It was right at the start. These unhoused folks, it was really violent. And so people left I will not go into detail, but it was pretty crazy situation, so I understand. But they kept the ride going. People were still interested in doing the ride. So after the ambulances were called, and it's crazy.
Interesting.
I'll tell you that story later.
Cool. So I guess now that we've kind of discussed a lot of this, and you've rehashed it, are there things outside of what we've discussed that you wish you had known when you began this journey, or things that you've learned since that we didn't discuss that would be beneficial to you 10 years ago?
That's a good question. I guess kind of how I work is I try to learn with every ride. It provides a lesson. Every ride provides a lesson. So it's hard for me to pinpoint something I wish I would have known, because I try to fix that unknown on the next ride. So honestly, when I refrain from all beer prior to my rides that leave from breweries. I do not want to have any kind of alcohol in my head when I'm trying to do. Waited for that motorcycle. When I'm trying to do my interp and for the ride, just safety purposes. And I wish I would have known that initially. Like I wish I would have known my body a little bit better at the beginning. But I don't think that's typical for a lot of social rides, is having alcohol involved. But you just have to learn from your mistakes. Having a map, I wish I would have had like an actual paper map made in case there are situations where, oh shoot, there's construction all of a sudden. I didn't see this on my preliminary ride. We got to make a detour, so I can actually look at the paper map and be like, okay, we can go down this road. So anything can happen, and so having a lot of information at hand to make those kind of last-minute decisions is really important. And it's taken me a long time to realize that, I guess.
Great. So do you have like some of those things kind of written out, like thinking through who your assistants and co-organizers will be? Do you have like documents, templates, checklists?
Most of it is kind of, I have a book. Everything is written in my History Bike book. And there's lots of notes in there, watch out for this, watch out for that, stand, and when this one, like if we're at a stop, I want to highlight where I'm going to be standing, like so I remember, like this is the best place to stand for this because the sun won't be in people's eyes, or something along those lines. And when I'm dealing with bigger organizations as partners, like the Florida Museum of Natural History, they have a lot of different rules as far as what we should be discussing, what we shouldn't be discussing, and the physicality of the ride too. It has to be entry-level bike riding, because they get like a lot of young folks out there. And older folks that participate in those rides. But yeah, all that stuff is kind of written down, noted. And again, even if it's just me, I try to have organization because my brain doesn't work like it used to, Joe.
So are any of those things in a format, or could they be in a format that we could share with listeners later?
They could be in a format. They're not right now, but they could definitely be in a format. Yeah, absolutely. I would be happy to put together a document that helps address some of those points.
You heard it here first.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great.
By next year. We'll get it to you by next year. No problem.
Awesome. Just when they'll need it, when it's sunny out. So I guess my last kind of question would be, in your event, you are doing it kind of as part of your job. Mm-hmm. Is that a fair assessment? And so do you think that makes it easier and more tenable for you as an organizer to just kind of keep it going versus if it were strictly volunteer?
Wow, that's a tough one. Yeah, I think it helps because I want to do this, but it's also really up to me. And it's so important to have community support with these kinds of social interactions, like these group community interactions. It's really important to have the community behind me, or I'm just not going to be interested, and I'll find something else to, fulfill that part of my job. But yeah, it's helpful when it's work because it forces my hand. I tend to procrastinate, and you can't with this kind of thing. You can't when you're trying to convey information because a lot of people do know this information, and so if you provide the incorrect information, you could get called on that. Luckily, that hasn't happened. Well, that's not true. It has happened, but yeah, I try to be as prepared as possible, and it takes a lot of work, this kind of thing.
So if I could kind of rephrase that back to you, work obviously makes it pay you to do it, but more importantly, it offers some sort of structure and accountability?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there definitely is. The structure is good because I know what, with all the events that I do, whether it's a speaking engagement at a museum, or I'm talking in the public schools, or I'm teaching a workshop, or I'm doing the bike tour, I try to revolve around 2 hours. I try to keep all events within 2 hours, roughly, unless it's going to be a longer term workshop or something like that. Because I think that's really the bulk of people's interest, particularly when you're dealing with younger folks. Keeping their interest for that set amount of time, it takes a lot of work, and going beyond that set amount of time takes a lot more, like a lot more work. So the ride helps with that because it stops the monotony of listening to a lecture. But yeah, keeping things tight and organized for like work purposes is, that's I think that helps the greater scheme of things.
And I'm sure the person assisting you with social media helps a lot too.
Yeah, hugely. Yeah, yeah, and she's doing great actually. Our upcoming ride is was all by her design, so and that's going to be exciting.
New first.
Yeah.
Milestone. I love it.
Milestone.
Yeah, so nothing else that I missed that you can think of?
I don't think so, man. That was really covered it all. It was great. Yeah, and I think just to reiterate one of your points, building up the community, which in order to do that, you have to have regularly scheduled rides. Like you have to actually have the events for the community to get behind. And so sometimes that's a struggle, especially if you're just doing a ride where you're just riding. But if, like, I'm throwing, I have to do public historical interpretation on top of it. So a lot of times the preparation will just stall out the ride. And it's, in order to get that community response and the community involvement, you got to do the rides. You have to do the rides.
Awesome. So if there were anything that your ride community could do to help or make the rides more successful, what do you think that would be?
Oh, wow. I don't know. That's a really good question. That's a stumper. I've tried to bring discussion groups on the event posts that I've done on Facebook or something like that, get people talking about the ride, get them excited about it early, get them asking questions about it, and then after the fact, sharing pictures, trying to get that community to continue outside of the ride, or at least the interest in the event to spread outside of the ride. I mean, I think that's challenging. I think that's one of the most difficult parts about trying to build community through these kinds of events is people have lives and stuff to do. And you might be 100% devoted to building this community and building up the social rides and the group and the communications, and not everybody's on the same page with that. So that is a challenge.
Yeah.
Probably.
And I mean, the way that we're trying to, or at least I am trying to overcome that challenge or address it, is just by being more open in the rides, more open in, somebody came up with a graphic for a logo for us and made stickers.
Yeah.
And they're like, should we name the little guy on the sticker? And I was like, well, maybe we should put it out in the Discord. Maybe we should have a naming contest, right? So that they own the whatever artifact, the mascot, what have you. And so I think it's just finding ways to let people know that they have ownership too.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, stickers is great. I'm glad you brought that up. I have a couple of different stickers for History Bike, and I really love seeing them on people's cars. Or I've seen them like in totally unrelated situations on people's bikes before, like pulling up to see a show at the Hippodrome, and I've seen people have a History Bike Gainesville sticker on their bikes, and I just love it because that means that person liked this ride enough to, get this sticker, and so they're kind of communicating what this is, and people ask questions. So yeah, I think those are really good ways to kind of keep the life in this kind of thing. That was very. You shouldn't use the word thing very often, kids. You should be specific. Be more specific, Nigel.
So with that, Nigel, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you for agreeing to pull things out of your journal in a year.
Yes.
And thank you for sharing your knowledge.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Thank you so much for listening until the end. And special thanks to the people that made this episode possible. We could not do it without our amazing guests and support from listeners like you. Join our Patreon if you want to support this content too. Do you think we missed a key question in the episode? Or have an idea for a future guest? Fill out the ideas form at socialrideguide.com. And while you're there, consider subscribing to our newsletter to be the first to know when new episodes and ride organizer resources are available.